Okay, let's jump right into one of the most talked about frontiers in AI right now. These models that seem to generate step-by-step processes.
Right, almost like thinking out loud. Large reasoning models, LRMs.
Exactly. And there's this feeling, that this thinking process is a big leap, getting us closer to AI that's genuinely intelligent.
It definitely feels like that. But it also makes you ask, well, what's really going on under the hood? Is it actual reasoning or is it something else? And crucially, how well does it hold up when things get, really difficult?
That's the core question, and it brings us to the source material for this deep dive. We got our hands on this fascinating paper, and the title alone kind of grabs you. The Illusion of Thinking.
Yeah, it's a great title.
It really tries to push past the hype, digging into what these thinking models can actually do, how their performance changes as problems get harder, and maybe most interestingly, where they hit these really unexpected walls.
It's a solid piece of research because they set things up specifically to probe the process, not just whether the final answer is right or wrong.
So our mission here for this deep dive is basically to unpack all that for you. We'll look at how these thinking AIs were tested in a maybe different way than usual.
Definitely different.
What the paper found about their performance across easy, medium, and hard problems, and then get into those surprising limitations they uncovered.
Yeah, we're going to see where the whole step-by-step thing helps, but also maybe counterintuitively where it might actually get in the way.
All right, let's get into it. So the first thing that makes this study different is how they decided to test these models. Usually you see AI tested on standard benchmarks, right? Math problems, coding challenges.
Yeah, those standard test sets. And benchmarks are, well, they're useful for comparing models generally, but they have some real drawbacks if you're trying to study reasoning specifically.
Right, what?
Well, the big one is data contamination. It's really hard to be sure if the model is genuinely solving a novel problem or if it just saw something super similar, maybe even the answer, in its training data.
Ah, right. It might just be pattern matching something it already knows.
Exactly. And with most benchmarks, you typically just get the final answer. It's hard to peek inside the step-by-step process or, finally control exactly how complex the problem is.
So the researchers needed something cleaner.
They needed more controlled environment. And their solution was, honestly, pretty clever. They used controllable puzzle environments. Think classic logic puzzles.
Okay.
These have really simple, clear rules, but you can scale the difficulty up precisely, step by step. And importantly, you can check if every single step the AI takes is valid.
Which puzzles did they use?
They picked 4 well-known ones. You've got the Tower of Hanoi.
Yeah, moving the discs.
The classic.
Huh.
Then checker jumping, which is about swapping pieces on a line.
Okay.
River crossing problems, like the missionaries and cannibals puzzle, getting your way across safely.
Right, constraint satisfaction.
Exactly. And block swirl, which is about stacking blocks in a certain order.
And the power here is?
Well, like you said, precise control over complexity. Add more discs, add more checkers, add more people needing to cross the river. It gets harder in measurable ways.
But you said the key was checking the steps.
That's the real game changer here. Because these puzzles have simulators programs that know the rules perfectly. The researchers could validate every single move the AI proposed in its thinking process.
Not just the final configuration.
No, every intermediate thought or action.
Yeah.
This lets them look directly at the AI's attempt at reasoning, moment by moment. It's like watching its work on a scratch pad.
Okay, so that's a really neat setup. They've got these controllable puzzles. They can check every step. So they took models like Claude 3.7 Sonnet Thinking, DeepSeek R1.
The LRMs, yeah.
And compared them against their standard counterparts, the ones that don't explicitly generate thinking steps.
Right, like the base Claude 3.7 Sonnet or DeepSeek V3.
So what happened when they actually ran the tests? What did they find?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The results weren't straightforward. Performance seemed to fall into 3 pretty distinct zones or regimes, depending on how complex the puzzle was.
3 regimes. Okay, what's the first one?
The first regime is low complexity, the really easy versions of the puzzles. And this is where they hit their first surprise.
Oh, what happened?
Well, you'd naturally assume the model's designed to think step by step would just ace the simple stuff, right?
Yeah, seems obvious.
But they didn't. Always. The paper actually showed that for the easiest problems, the standard non-syncing LLMs were often more accurate.
More accurate?
Yeah. And they also used fewer tokens, meaning they were more efficient, computationally cheaper.
Wait, hang on. So adding the explicit thinking process for easy tasks actually made the models less accurate and less efficient. That feels backward.
It is. It's really counterintuitive.
Right.
It suggests that the overhead, or maybe just the nature of that explicit step-by-step generation, isn't always helpful. It might even be detrimental when the solution is simple.
Okay, that's weird. So thinking can actually hurt on easy stuff. What about medium complexity? When things get a bit harder.
Now this is where the thinking models started to shine. In that middle zone, the medium complexity regime, the LRMs, the ones generating the steps, they showed a clear advantage in accuracy over the non-thinking models.
Okay, so the step-by-step process paid off there.
It seemed to. That extra processing, generating the intermediate steps, helped them navigate the slightly trickier logic compared to the models that just jump to an answer.
Right, so there's a sweet spot. Low complexity, thinking hurts. Medium complexity, thinking helps. What about high complexity?
That's the third regime, and it's pretty dramatic. If you look at the graphs in the paper for this high complexity zone, you just see accuracy plummet,
Plummet how?
often straight down to zero. Just
Yeah.
failure. Beyond a certain threshold of difficulty for these puzzles, both the thinking models and the standard LLMs completely failed to solve them. A total collapse.
Wow, okay, so even the thinking doesn't save them when it gets really tough.
Not at all. And that collapse point, especially for the LRMs, revealed something else that was really, really puzzling about how they work.
What was that?
Well, the researchers looked closely at a specific metric: the number of thinking tokens the model generated.
Okay, so like the amount of text in their internal scratch pad, a measure of effort.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How much work, how much thinking they were writing down for themselves.
So my intuition would be as the problem gets harder, they should generate more thinking tokens, right? Try harder, explore more steps.
And that's what happens.
Yeah.
Initially, up to a point. As the puzzles get more complex, going from low to medium difficulty, the LRMs do use more thinking tokens.
Okay, makes sense.
But, and this is the really counterintuitive finding, as problems get even harder, approaching that complexity level where the accuracy just collapses to zero,
Yeah.
the models actually start using fewer thinking tokens. Their measured effort goes down.
Hold on. So right when the problem is getting the most difficult, when they presumably need to think the hardest, they actually reduce their thinking effort.
Precisely. Even though they have plenty of token budget left, they're not running out of space to think their apparent reasoning effort decreases just before they completely fail.
That doesn't make sense. Why would they do that?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a major finding of the paper. It points towards some kind of fundamental scaling limitation. It's not just about raw computation. Something about the increasing complexity seems to trigger this. Reduction in effort, maybe a change in strategy that's ultimately detrimental.
That's fascinating. And maybe one of the most important points. It suggests their thinking isn't just scaling up with the difficulty. It hits a wall and then does something strange.
Exactly. And because they had those puzzle simulators and could check every step.
They could look inside the thoughts during these different regimes.
Right. They could analyze those intermediate steps, the traces the models generated, and see what was happening to the thinking process itself at low, medium, and high complexity.
Okay, so what did the traces look like at low complexity where the thinking models were actually worse?
This is where they saw what they called overthinking. It was bizarre. The model would often generate the correct sequence of moves to solve the puzzle very early on in its thought process.
Okay, great. Solved it.
You'd think. But then it would just keep going, generating more steps, exploring incorrect alternative solutions after it had already found the right one.
Seriously. It found the answer and then talked itself out of it or just kept pointlessly exploring.
Kind of. It was like finding the right path out of the woods, but then wandering off down dead ends anyway. Highly inefficient, computationally speaking.
Which explains why the standard LLMs were better. They just gave the simple answer without all the unnecessary internal detours.
That seems to be the case. Now move up to moderate complexity, where the thinking models did have an edge.
Yeah.
The pattern reversed. Now the correct solution sequences tended to emerge only later in the thinking process. The model would explore several incorrect paths first, and then eventually land on the right one.
Okay, so it shows some ability to explore and maybe self-correct, but it's still not a very direct or efficient path to the solution.
Exactly. It's working. It's better than the non-thinker here, but it's still a bit messy, a bit meandering.
And then high complexity, the collapse regime.
In those traces where accuracy was zero, the researchers found that the thinking process simply contained no correct solution paths at all.
So it wasn't just failing to pick the right answer from its thoughts.
No, it wasn't even generating any viable paths toward the solution in the first place.
Yeah.
The thinking itself broke down.
Wow. Okay, that paints a much clearer and maybe more worrying picture. The thinking works in a limited zone, but it has these strange failure modes, overthinking easy stuff, inefficiently exploring medium stuff, and just completely failing to generate solutions for hard stuff.
That sums it up pretty well. And the paper highlights a couple more specific findings that really underscore how puzzling these limitations are.
Like what?
One experiment that really jumped out at me was about executing algorithms. They took the Tower of Hanoi puzzle again.
Okay.
But this time, instead of just asking the model to solve it, they explicitly gave it the recursive algorithm, the mathematical formula for solving Tower of Hanoi.
So they literally gave it the instructions, like step 1, do this, step 2, do that.
Exactly. Here are the precise steps. Just follow them. The expectation, obviously, was that performance should shoot way up. The model doesn't have to figure out the strategy anymore, just execute the known steps.
Makes sense. Did it work?
Astonishingly, no. Performance didn't dramatically improve. Accuracy didn't really increase much, and crucially, the collapse to zero accuracy still happened at roughly the same complexity level, the same number of disks, as when the models had to figure out the strategy themselves.
Get out. So even when you hand it the perfect step-by-step instructions for a complex task, it still can't reliably follow them beyond a certain point.
That's what they found. It's a pretty stark result. It suggests the limitations go beyond just finding the right strategy. There might be fundamental problems in like reliably executing logical steps or verifying intermediate states or just keeping track of things over a long sequence of operations.
That points to a deeper issue than just reasoning in the abstract. And you said there was another baffling result.
Yeah, an inconsistency across different types of puzzles. They saw this very clearly with one of the models, Claude 3.7 Sonnet Thinking.
Okay.
So think about Tower of Hanoi with N10 disks. Solving that optimally takes over 1,000 moves, but let's say even getting a significant portion correct requires maybe over 100 correct steps.
Right, a long sequence.
What they found was, for N10 Tower of Hanoi, the model would often make its first mistake quite late in the sequence, maybe around move 100 or even later.
Okay, so it could follow a pretty long chain of logic for that specific puzzle, even if it eventually failed.
Right. But now compare that to the river crossing puzzle. Let's take N3, which involves getting, say, 3 pairs of people across. The optimal solution for that is only 11 moves long, much shorter.
Okay, 11 moves versus potentially 100 plus for Hanoi.
And yet, the same model, Claude 3.7 Sonnet Thinking, on river crossing N3, often failed by move 4.
Wait, it failed on step 4 of an 11-step solution, but could manage 100 steps on a much longer puzzle. That seems completely inconsistent.
It is wildly inconsistent, especially when you consider that the same model had near-perfect accuracy on Tower of Hanoi N5, which takes 31 moves, much longer than the 11 moves for river crossing N3, where it failed so early.
What on earth could explain that? It's not just about the length of the reasoning chain, then.
The researchers have a hypothesis, and it ties back to something we discussed earlier.
Training data.
Exactly. They suspect it might not be about the inherent logical difficulty of the puzzles themselves, but simply about how often similar problems appeared in the model's training data. Maybe examples of Tower of Hanoi are relatively common online, even for moderately high-end.
But river crossing puzzles, especially beyond the simplest N1 or N2 cases, might be much, much rarer.
That's the idea. So the model might have effectively learned or even partially memorized the patterns for Tower of Hanoi through sheer exposure, but hasn't seen enough examples of slightly more complex river crossing problems to generalize or learn that specific pattern structure.
So its apparent reasoning skill is incredibly sensitive to how well represented that exact type of problem was in its training.
It strongly suggests that possibility, which, again, really makes you question whether we're seeing general reasoning ability or just extremely sophisticated pattern matching based on the training distribution.
And that brings us right back to that title, The Illusion of Thinking. These results, the algorithm execution failure, the inconsistency, they really feed into that idea that maybe it just looks like reasoning sometimes.
It certainly complicates the picture.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together. This deep dive into the illusion of thinking paper, it really gives us a much more nuanced, maybe even skeptical view of these large reasoning models.
Definitely. I think the big takeaway is that while this step-by-step thinking process does seem to offer a real advantage for problems of medium complexity.
Right, that sweet spot.
It's absolutely not a magic bullet. It doesn't just scale up indefinitely.
Yeah, they hit these fundamental scaling limits where accuracy just craters, falls to zero, and maybe most bizarrely, their measurable thinking effort actually decreases right when the problems get hardest.
And looking inside those thoughts, We see these strange behaviors like wasteful overthinking on simple tasks, and then a complete inability to even generate correct paths when things get truly complex.
And those really surprising findings just hammer the point home. They struggle to reliably execute an algorithm even when it's given to them explicitly.
Yeah, that Tower of Hanoi result was striking.
And their reasoning seems inconsistent across different types of puzzles, which might just boil down to what they happen to see during training, not some general intelligence.
This research really forces us, and anyone interested in AI, to look critically at what we actually mean when we say an AI is thinking or reasoning.
It shows that while these models are incredibly powerful and advancing rapidly, there are still these profound, sometimes really counterintuitive limits to their ability to generalize and reason reliably, especially on complex or unfamiliar ground.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question to think about, doesn't it? If this isn't quite genuine, generalizable reasoning, then what would that look like in an AI? And maybe more practically, how do we actually build systems that can tackle hard, novel problems reliably without hitting these walls or, reducing their effort when things get tough? How do we get beyond performance on potentially familiar benchmarks?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Moving from models that are good pattern recognizers to systems capable of robust, adaptable reasoning. It's a huge open question for the future of AI.